Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk series. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I speak, the Cammeraygal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and also to the elders on the lands on which all of you are speaking from as well, and to any Aboriginal persons who may be watching at some time. So tonight's topic is resilience. And resilience, I don't know, you probably understand resilience to mean the ability to bounce back from adversity. This is the general kind of understanding of resilience. I have long had issue with that understanding of resilience and this ability to bounce back from adversity. I think it's far more complex than this little black and white kind of understanding. And I'll explain why. During the noughties, there was a psychological trend which quickly became the flavour of the month in resilience was the word. So all through community services, we were building resilient communities and we were teaching kids to be resilient. There were training sessions rolled out across the community services sector and the education sector. Books were written on it, articles were published, and resilience training was incorporated into a lot of adolescent programs. And then after a few years, resilience kind of morphed into the happiness movement, which I'm terribly sorry if anyone here is into it, but I'm terribly cynical about that happiness movement as well. And then the happiness movement has morphed into the hope movement, which I have to tell you I'm actually not cynical about. So what does it all mean? Well, resilience does need, I believe, to be understood within the context of the individual and their situation. But in general terms, resilience, and I'm coming now from a completely spiritual perspective, resilience is an essential state of the soul. It is as real to the soul as is being peaceful, being loving, being blissful, being calm, being creative and spontaneous. So we are all born resilient. It is part of who we are spiritually. And so it's as real as your arm or your body. And so we're born resilient and we are resilient. The soul is resilient. And so do we need to build resilience or to be trained in resilience when it's already who we are? I think, during childhood, we don't exactly cognitively know what our essential states are. But internally, we do know. And I think parents and families will model very active resilience if and when they experience setbacks. And so young kids will start to become aware of how their parents negotiate the setbacks of life and how they respond and how they deal with things. It may be something that's just going on in the family, or it may be environmental, maybe personal. Maybe one of the children, other siblings in the family has some kind of illness or whatever, and the whole family has to adjust. Parents have to adjust. So all of these things kids learn from. And so when a toddler is learning to walk, it will fall over again and again. But does it give up? No. Why? Because the toddler is programmed to learn to walk. And so until the muscles and the bones are strong enough, it will keep on trying. Do babies care if they fall over? No. Are they ashamed because they fell over? No. They just keep going because that is their resilience. They don't analyse anything. It's in our DNA to do these things, to develop and to move forward. And so, after a war, countries and societies, communities turn to rebuilding themselves and moving on. After a pandemic and natural disasters, people pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives and their communities. And one way or another, countries, communities, and families will have always done this and will always do this. The only time when it does not happen is at the end of a civilization. But one civilization ends and another one begins. So everything goes on. And so I would say that the importance of hope really cannot be overstated. Even if long established goals and understanding of norms have to change, hope and being able to flow with changing circumstances, requires hope, it requires resilience as well, and the trust that things will work out for the best, even when I might not be able to see how this will happen or can happen. It can still happen. And it may seem miraculous, I remember when those little boys got trapped in those 13 kids, little boys, the football team got trapped in the cave over in Malaysia or Indonesia, was it? I never thought, I analysed that situation. I thought they will never get those kids out of there. 4.5 kilometres in a cave under the ground. And I just couldn't see how they could get those kids out. But they did. They got the lot of them out. Amazing. So, these amazing things do happen. And that's because we are resilient. And it's because, we have hope. It's because in our DNA, in our spiritual DNA, all these fabulous things are there. They're laid in. They're a part of us. It's our programming. And so We are spiritually and biologically programmed to live and to grow and to move forward, to progress. And even massive amounts of setbacks cannot deter anyone from persisting with deeply held goals. So I just want to put a question out to you, because in talking about resilience, because to me, resilience is all about the art of living. The art of living in the best kind of way that we possibly can. And so I'm going to ask you a question. And the question is, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? So, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Or, put it another way, taken all together, would you say you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy with your life? So, you don't need to share your answer unless you would like to. And I'm just going to bring a slide up for you. I'm going to share my screen and show you.
Am I allowed to share, Jude?
Yes, you can. Yes, of course.
I would say happy.
You're happy?
Yeah.
Good on you.
Regardless of the situations, we have to be happy.
Good.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, so that question I just asked you about how satisfied you are with your life is going to denote something that we call your subjective well-being. Oops, we don't want that just yet. So there are three components of subjective well-being. The first is life satisfaction. The second is positive affect. And the third is negative affect. So here we have a graph. And you can see that the person whose well-being was measured on this graph, you can see that over the years between 58 and 86, they didn't digress very much from that sort of set point. Now, that straight line across from 6 would be their set point. So if you think back when you were maybe about 20, and if you were to draw this, put it on a piece of paper and to really think about it quietly when you're on your own, and think about your life satisfaction, the dots, and put dots for the years, and then you draw a line through the sort of middle of all those dots. You will get your set point, what we call your set point. And your set point is important because that is your sort of default position, we would say. There may be a year that you get married and you're divinely happy, and few years later you get divorced and you're very depressed, or you have kids and there are problems, or whatever goes on, or there's a war, and you're affected by that, or there's, a natural disaster in the country which also affects you. So these environmental things will have an influence, but your wherever you draw your line will be your own set point. And one of the things that happens when conditions throw you into, it may be external conditions are very, very unfavourable, or it may be that your own internal conditions are very unfavourable. You may develop a mental illness. Someone may develop a mental or physical illness that causes them to feel very hopeless or depressed or whatever. They may not, that can be added to if that person does not feel supported or cared about. So there are a range of things that can happen here. But I was, as some of you will know, I worked with refugees in our immigration detention centres for 4 years. And this red line across the graph here is the midpoint. It's the 5. And so we're using a scale of 0 to 10 here. What was happening with a lot of the people I was working with in detention was that they were dropping down into this really apathetic state of being, where they had no hope, they ceased to care about themselves. They felt they had gone into such a deep state, and that state is called, we've seen it happen in our Indigenous communities, both here in Australia and in other countries, where people are very downtrodden and oppressed in minority groups. And that state is called homeostatic defeat. And so we say that below 5, the person is moving into homeostatic defeat. And homeostatic defeat is a place that it's very hard to come out of. Very, very difficult to get people out of homeostatic defeat. And one of the problems that was going on with our immigration detention centres, one of the problems, this is when we actually were giving people full protection visas. That was actually, both governments have done that, but the Labor government was being much more generous with them, I have to say. In my early days of working in those centres, if a person had been in detention for a certain length of time and they'd gone into homeostatic defeat, even though they were released, so much of them were still in homeostatic defeat that they would need incredible amount of support when they were released from detention. They were too far gone to go and get a job and to just sort of energetically throw themselves into creating a new life for themselves. And, we see this in our Indigenous communities too, but just being oppressed for 240 years. You don't just bounce back. And this is why I say resilience, you know, when we talk about resilience, that it's the ability to bounce back from adversity, it's such an oversimplification. Because the Indigenous people in Australia is just as resilient. They're born just as resilient as the white fellas are and every other fella. But the environmental circumstances can have a huge impact on a person's resilience. Being in a minority group, you know, people who are LGBTQI are much more prone to serious depression and suicide. So, you know, that's why I say these simplistic state explanations of resilience and so on really have no place. We really do have to take into account a person's circumstances and the context of our society, and the overriding philosophies that are emanating from Canberra, the kind of rhetoric that is being bandied around. You know, the same-sex marriage debate did so much harm for queer people. It just was incredibly harmful. And so, you know, there are lots of factors that, again, just become another factor in pushing someone down quite in a very cruel way. So the other argument or big debate here, which I find quite interesting, is that economists have always, and even accountants, have declared that the indicator of, a general indicator of subjective well-being, and this has been internationally economists have decided that it was their call on subjective well-being. And they said, oh, well, it's according to the GDP, because if a country has a high GDP, then the people will all have a high level of subjective well-being. However, social scientists have taken up a huge argument with this, and I would have to say, to a large extent, psychologists as well. They decided, and they took this up academically and challenged the economists, that measuring a person's level of subjective happiness is not really up to an outside party or an economist who's never met people individually. That the person themselves is the best judge of their subjective level of well-being. And so social scientists began asking people how happy they were, or, you know, how satisfied they were with their life. And economists just thought this was the biggest joke of all time. However, social scientists and joined by psychologists have brought about significant change in the understanding of subjective well-being. Despite being treated with extreme derision, they have changed that perception. And in social science now, we understand that GDP can influence, can be a factor for many people in their subjective well-being. And I think a lot of the studies that have come from economists more recently, who are challenging the sort of woke white capitalist movement, which we see to be a very, very influential and dangerous movement, because it's part of this. When you study sociology, you study economics, because economics explains so much of sociology. That's these days, and I have a degree in this, so I absolutely love studying economics. And what we see is that people who experience, they may live in a country with a high GDP, like if you see here, Australia is in the top third of those countries where all the green dots are. We've got Canada and Norway at the top. Then we've got Philippines, surprisingly, just below Norway, and above Netherlands, and under Netherlands, we've got Australia. And next to Australia, we've got Colombia, level with Australia. In fact, a little bit higher, we've got Colombia. I mean, this really is amazing, because the GDPs vary with these countries quite significantly, and yet they're all in the top third. So Australia has a high GDP, and Australians generally have a high level of subjective well-being. And so we would say where there's a high level of subjective well-being, people are resilient. But if that drops into homeostatic defeat, if it drops below the 5 mark, then we're not going to see the same kind of resilience. And, you know, when I was working up on Nauru, I was working very much with families. There are a lot of families up there from lots of different countries. And I used to run groups, play groups for the preschoolers. And so I would do them in all the different language groups. Fridays, it was wall-to-wall play groups for the preschoolers and their parents. So both parents would hopefully come. And it was really interesting. Through those play groups, I learned so much about those different cultures. And it was the people at the highest level of resilience in those groups, the highest subjective well-being, were the Tamils from Sri Lanka, who had come from, you know, terrible situations of where their whole families have been killed in that country. Very, very, very dangerous. Still is. And the people with the lowest level of resilience and the lowest sense of well-being were the Rohingyas from Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called. And those people, and I could tell from their parenting skills, they were the Rohingyas were so, the parents were, they had so disconnected from their kids, their little kids. Oh, it was so sad, I can't tell you. Because they didn't have the energy to parent. They didn't have the hope. They'd come from this terrible situation in Myanmar. You know, we all know how the Rohingyas are, such oppressed people. Over in Myanmar, and then they'd come up and they were locked up in Nauru after a terrible boat trip. And, you know, a lot of people coming over on those boat trips from Indonesia, you know, a lot of boats did sink. Many of the refugees lost family members. They lost their parents, their kids, their siblings, their partners, you know. They went through, you know, it's just an unimaginable hell to me. But the Rohingyas were just so in homeostatic defeat. And their parenting just suffered so badly. And whereas the people from Sri Lanka, they were the most fantastic parents. Their families were really stable. You know, they'd also gone through awful, violent, oppressive situations, living in terrible fear over there, escaping, getting on these terrible leaky boats, wondering if they'd ever survive the trip to Australia. And yet they had quite a high level of resilience. And the people from Iran are absolutely, I have to say, pretty hopeless parents. And I think that probably was cultural rather than their subjective well-being. Hope I'm not offending anybody here, by the way. Because I'm sure there are lots and lots of people from Iran who make wonderful parents. But that situation on Nauru was pretty tough. People from Iraq, alternately, generally were more functional parents. So, you know, it gave me a great insight into the different cultures, looking through this lens, you know, of what these people had been through and how it was affecting their level of well-being. So homeostatic defeat, getting below level 5, is a very definite marker. And this is what's happened to so many remote Indigenous communities in this country, where we've seen our First Nations people just after so much oppression, just immersed in homeostatic defeat. And it's so difficult to get people out of that state. And I'm just wondering, feel free to answer this question. If you have any idea what helps people to get out of this. There are two things. In my experience. And The first, at an emotional level, is anger. That if we can get people, and I used to do this in detention deliberately, was really support people to get into their anger so that I could hold them from going into homeostatic defeat. And hopefully hold them long enough for them to get a visa and get the hell out of detention so that they could survive the detention experience. Because anger is, I know it's considered a negative emotion, but actually it's a life-saving emotion. You know, it gives us a whole lot of adrenaline and motivation, etc., etc. And, you know, I used to deal with a great deal of anger when I worked in detention. And I just thought, great, you know, I totally reframed it for myself because I understood how important it was for these people to be angry because it was saving them from something, a fate far, far worse that would be really hard to come out of. The other thing that I want to mention to you that, again, this is an economic theory that I find absolutely fascinating, is that when we look at different countries, countries like America and Australia and England, compared to Finland and Switzerland and Sweden and you know, some of the Nordic countries who have a very different sort of political system and a very different economic system to us, what we see is that, you know, we've got in America, England and Australia, we have this, and I'm sure you've heard the term, this trickle-down economic system, which I would suggest very strongly to you is about to change significantly in Australia. Labor have been calling it and naming it for the last 9 years. And so it will be incumbent upon them to change it. And what it does, it creates a huge division in wealth and it erodes the middle class. And what we see when the middle class is eroded, we see the situation of third world countries where you get this very small group of people who have all the wealth and the mass population who are poor. And when you get that, this is what trickle-down economics deliberately does. And so this is why with trickle-down economics, we see that the wealthy don't pay tax, companies don't pay tax, the poor pay the tax. The middle class really gets slugged, and so they start to move into poverty. They start getting eroded and moving into poverty. And we've seen this wealth division really increase in Australia in the last 9 years of, well, John Howard started it actually, Labor stopped it, and then Liberal government started it again. And what we know happens when the wealth division, the gap gets really wide, or even starts to widen, we start to see in our society the social indicators increase. Now, the social indicators are mental health, domestic violence, there's heaps of them, addiction to substances and other things, criminality. So all of these social indicators that, you know, a government will spend money on dealing with these social issues, these social issues start to require a great deal bigger spend in a society where equality is lost and where wealth, there is not a reasonable distribution of wealth. I'm not talking, you know, about purist socialism or communism. I'm simply talking about the right mix of capitalism and socialism. So getting the mix right and getting that balance right. You know, it's been so researched and so studied. And so in a social system or an economic system, political system, where there's the right balance of those things, we will get an equitable distribution of wealth. We will have a high basic wage. And in the countries like Sweden and Finland and so on, where you've got the high basic wage and an equitable distribution of wealth, you've got a very high standard of living for everybody. And so the social indicators are very, very, very low. Someone from Singapore was explaining to me that they have a one-party system in Singapore and that there's hardly any poverty. There's no homeless people on the streets. They pay, everyone pays tax, and there's very full employment. There's no homelessness. And so that it's a very buoyant society. So the government is not spending money on all these social indicators. And this is what happens in a healthy society, a healthy, resilient society. We will see, so, you know, to a degree, the economists are right, the GDP, but also they're not right, because many people in a country with a high GDP will not be sharing the love. They will not be sharing the wealth, and they will be doing it really tough. We see that in this country. And we have a pretty good GDP in this country. We're a wealthy country, and most of us who live in Australia have a pretty good life. Will that continue to be in the future for the younger generations? Well, big question mark there. Very hard for people to get into the housing market. So when we look at the future, you know, we have to take all these things into account of building a more equitable system, a healthier, more resilient system for the future. Because, you know, a social system where there is huge amounts of money need to be spent on mental health and health. You know, health is another social indicator. Get all these sick people and a huge spend on hospitals. You know, health is I think it's our biggest bill in this country, isn't it? Isn't our biggest cost health in Australia? I'm sure it is. And it is in England as well. And what the research has shown is that people who are living below the line, they lose their self-esteem. When you have a low basic wage, when you erode the basic wage, like in America, it's so low. You know, mum and dad are both working several jobs, working 50 hours a week each, both of them, just to keep just to cover their basics, because the basic wage is so low, and all these companies like Walmart and McDonald's and KFC and all these big companies, multinationals, they just pay casual rates. They won't have permanent employees, and so people are just doing it so tough. And so we see, really high levels of criminality and addiction, domestic violence, all that sort of thing. So resilience gets really, really affected by these factors. And so if we, in order to have a very resilient society, we need to have more than a high GDP. I mean, the Philippines, I don't know offhand how high their GDP is, but it's nothing like Australia, nothing like. There's so much poverty in the Philippines, and yet their subjective well-being is higher than ours. So we have to look at all of these aspects around when we look at resilience. Okay, slides are finished. Let me go back to this one. So our happiness and life satisfaction, they're central research areas today in the social sciences and in mainstream economics. It's interesting now how, not so long ago, economics and social science were like really opposed to each other. Now they've come together. And so surveys, what the social scientists have been doing is recommending that measures of subjective well-being should augment the usual measures of economic prosperity, such as GDP. And this is definitely, very definitely, an influential factor, but it's not everything, because you may have a level of prosperity but be in a minority group. For instance, the white Christian heterosexual male is at the top of the triangle. The white Christian heterosexual educated male is at the top of the patriarchy. They're at the very top of the triangle. If you're an educated Christian black male, you will come down the triangle. if you're a white, educated, Christian, heterosexual woman, you will come down the triangle. And if you're a white, educated, Christian, queer, or LGBTQI male, you could fall considerably down the triangle. So, how can happiness be measured? Are there reliable comparisons of happiness across time and space? Surveys asking people about their life satisfaction and happiness do measure subjective well-being with reasonable accuracy. The research has shown this. So the surveys that the economists derided have been proven now to be actually very accurate, the most accurate measure of subjective well-being, which will also be probably the most accurate measure of resilience. So life satisfaction and happiness can vary widely within and among countries and, within a society. It only takes a glimpse at the data to see that people are distributed along a wide spectrum of levels of happiness and well-being. Richer people tend to say they are happier than poorer people, and richer countries tend to have a higher average happiness level. And across time, most countries that have experienced sustained economic growth have seen increasing happiness levels. Now, I was talking about Singapore before. That country doesn't have any resources. They don't have mines. They don't have natural resources that they can sell. And what they've done is they've put it into IT. They've really built up resources in IT and other AI and things like that. And so they sell that, and they're a very, very prosperous country. They're a very controlled country too. I don't know if any of you have been to Singapore. It's a very clean, perfect-looking country, and you wouldn't want to accidentally drop a Kleenex tissue or a cigarette butt. Oh my God, you could be in jail. So I think it's a fairly communist regime there, one-party system. So the evidence does suggest that income and life satisfaction, that there is a strong relationship between them, but it doesn't mean they're one and the same. So important life events such as marriage and divorce do affect our happiness, but have surprisingly little long-term impact. And because the evidence suggests that people just adapt, we just adapt to changes. And so it sort of brings me to the end of this. So I guess in a nutshell, resilience can be considered a very subjective thing. And why is it important? Because when we have a good level of resilience, we are able to meet the struggles and setbacks of life from a much better place, from a much, much better place. But can we teach people resilience? This is what we were trying to do in the noughties. I think parents can model it for their kids. And probably in a country where there's a reasonable GDP and a reasonable standard of living, where they're not, just monstrously oppressed. And I just want to finish with mentioning something. Last week I was actually talking about stages of spiritual growth. And so I want to bring that together with resilience, because what I was talking about last week, some of you will have missed, but it was recorded so you can watch it. That with a high level of spiritual growth, we become the resilience, it is an essential state. It is in the soul. But our essential states, the more spiritually grown we are, the more spiritually developed we are, then the more our essential states, the more radiant we become. And the more powerful and strong we become. And so the setbacks of life don't affect us in nearly the same way as they may affect another person who is not at that level of spiritual growth. It's interesting case in point is James Packer. Now, we all know who James Packer is, right? Does anybody not know? He's a billionaire, and he's Australian, and he comes from great wealth, so he inherited great wealth, and he inherited the Sydney Morning Herald, the Women's Weekly, this huge publishing house, all of which he's let go of, all of it. And he let go of all of the interesting stuff that his grandfather and father had created, and let go of all those businesses and concentrated on casinos and gambling. And after several failed marriages, there's a person with all the money. I mean, he's a billionaire. He's got more money than he knows what to do with. But is he happy? No. He's had such mental health problems with depression. And, there's a guy who, kind of watched him through the media sink into this really low place in life, just, the karma of running all these casinos and gambling stuff, which, it's such bad karma. How many people, how many families, how much does gambling cost our society? It's a huge cost to our society. Really working on getting people addicted to gambling, and so there he is. So money isn't everything. And, he could have any partner almost that he wants. I mean, he's been married to some, Mariah Carey, and, he doesn't just go for normal girls who live around the block. He's into this whole star thing. So, pardon? So is he resilient? He's not even showing huge resilience anymore. He throws his money around like a drunk sailor, hoping that that'll make him happy, but I don't think so. So I was talking about spiritual growth last week, stages of spiritual growth, and I didn't quite finish. So the way that we move from one level of moral development to the next level is through what's called cognitive dissonance, and that actually kind of fits here. And it's about our beliefs, values, and our actions, or our beliefs and values that inform our actions and behaviour. And when the beliefs, values, actions and behaviour of our workplace or an organisation where we belong to, or we have an affiliation with, a community that we may be part of, any social group, might be a church, might be a government, when their beliefs and values, actions or behaviour are in conflict with our own, we experience cognitive dissonance. And it's through cognitive dissonance that we grow. The discomfort that results means we will have to resolve it in some way. And if I'm involved with an organisation where I really want to be accepted, I want to be part of that organisation because it appeals, to me in some way, like wanting to be one of the cool kids at school. I really want to be part of this group, want to be part of this organisation or this community or workplace because it's really cool or it's going to make me look really good, whatever it is. I get there, I get into it, and then I experience there's a difference between my values and beliefs and those of the organisation. And so there's a conflict between our values and beliefs. And this sets up this experience of cognitive dissonance. One of the things in my field, that is discussed a lot is burnout. And, the other thing is vicarious trauma. And both vicarious trauma and burnout occur not because we're working in a human service where we're listening to the difficulties of another human being. That actually does not cause either burnout or vicarious trauma. Listening to those stories, it might be about their, abusive childhood or whatever. No, it's not that. It's when the organisation we are working for, their values and the way the organisation is being run is in conflict with our own values and beliefs. And it might be the organisation you're working for They have a wonderful, idealised mission statement, and yet the company, the actual practice of the company, is really in conflict with their own mission statement. And so this will set up not only cognitive dissonance, but it sets up for everyone burnout and depending on the, in a therapeutic, in a clinical environment, it can, when the organisation you're working for is abusing the clients you're helping and you can't stop it, you can't do anything about it, you will become really burned out and vicariously traumatised by that environment. I was talking to a PhD psychologist a couple of years ago, and she's worked with every minority group in Canada, homeless, refugees, heroin addicts, drug addicts, alcoholics, homeless, all those people. And in organisations where the rules were counter to really helping these people in a compassionate and humane way. And she said the levels of burnout and vicarious trauma were just going through the roof. And so if I want to stay connected with that organisation, I will have to resolve the discomfort in some way. If I want to stay with the organisation, I will have to suppress my own beliefs and values in order to align with those of the organisation and thus be accepted, or I will have to depart the group completely. The other thing that we can do, and this is what happened just over a week ago in our country, enough people were entirely fed up with the government, so they threw the government out. That has taken quite a long time. And so that is another way that things can get resolved, because there was a lot of cognitive dissonance created at that level. And so all of this plays a part in the way we can access our resilience. As I say, at a core level, we are resilient beings. And the more we can connect with the radiance of our spirituality and our essential states, our essential spiritual states of being, the more we can do that, the more we can empower ourselves through meditation and through gaining a great deal of spiritual strength through meditation, then the better placed we are to be able to access just our full capacity of resilience and all of the other beautiful and wonderful spiritual qualities that are there within all of us. And so in this, in that way, being in a good spiritual alignment with ourselves, that we can access incredible amounts of self-support. And self-support is really important. And when we can do it through a spiritual practice, we're in really good shape. because it makes us a lot less dependent on the environment and on external circumstances. We can remain stable in the eye of the storm, in other words, and we will have a much more expanded awareness and consciousness. So this is how resilience becomes very important in our art of living and really contributes to our art of living. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And are there any questions? No, not right at the moment. Okay. So let's just have a meditation. And for those of you who haven't been on this before, I'm not playing music because it gets very distorted over Zoom. But we will now. I'll just do a little bit of say a few words to get you in the zone.
Thanks, Judy.
And we'll meditate. So I allow my awareness to draw within, away from my thoughts, away from the world, away from my day. And I go to that still, quiet place inside, that beautiful, soft, gentle, safe space. Deep within myself, within my own heart. I feel so safe and so protected in this place. I feel so alive, and calm, peaceful. And I know when I'm in this space that whatever happens is meant to happen. And that I can flow with the drama and trust whatever happens, that I will be taken always to the safe shores of life. Divinely protected. And calm. And I stay in my peace. For I am resilient. I am strong. And I am soft and loving. And I feel all these qualities within myself. and I feel whole. Even when the storm is raging around me, I can disappear into the eye of the storm. Feel whole and complete, unafraid. As I withdraw into the silence, deeper and deeper, into the flowing river of silence. I feel the most purest divine love filling me, supporting me, holding me. Through everything, no matter what. This is my strength. And I immerse myself in this love and stillness. Shanti.